as, if you talk about what is innovation, there's a lot of books about this that have all kinds of different definitions about what innovation means. Who has read at least one of those books on screen? Okay. And and so one of the questions that innovation is really, and I looked at all of the definitions that were either in those books or that you can find online, and those are all on there. And then luckily somebody else already did an analysis of what that meant, and has something to do with an idea. So there's definitely creativity involved. It needs to add value to the consumer or customer. Also add value to the company, different perspective, different kind of thinking. And so this is really like, I'm going to change this a little bit. Does this work? Okay. So I came to this. Well, I didn't come to this. I sort of took whatever I thought was the best for all of these definitions and came to this definition. So innovation is to create value for potential customers through the execution of new ideas. And I know pretty sure that likely some people will say that's like not totally covering what I think it is, or it should be something different. I heard definitions before. If it's not new grounds, then it's not innovation. I think we should focus on, and that's also the interesting discussion when you talk about reinvention or innovation. I think reinvention is likely what we're doing here over the course of 3 days. We're trying to reinvent our business. How do we do this? By innovating. And I think because we're trying to come up and see how we can create this new value for what we can offer to our clients. And I think we should keep it open to innovation as in this creation of new value, not necessarily only into this new grounds or something that has never been done before, because it puts us away from a whole range of possible solutions that could possibly fix it, because it has to be never been done before kind of thing. It's a little bit what creative agencies are trying to do in Cannes. So they're missing out on a whole series of really beautiful campaigns and consumer solutions because they want to do something that has never been done before. I literally see creative teams ditching ideas that are a perfect solution for a campaign or a client brief, but they don't want to do it because somebody's done it before. Makes no sense. I mean, it's not a better idea or a worse idea because of this. So this is what I want to focus on. And if we look at, this is really annoying, I'm going to stand somewhere else. That's better. Look at indeed the desirability. Is there a specific need for this? Is it viable for our business to do this? And is it technological or technically feasible? And I don't want to focus too much on the technicality of this, because, and that's what I think you said, one of the key things that I think we're doing wrong with innovation is that we automatically make this a technology discussion. I think it's totally wrong. And I'm a technology person, right? I'm fascinated by technology, but I think if we focus on technology, we're rubbing it the wrong way. Why? And this is what you'll see all day long, and you'll see it both in the campaigns that we do and in the solutions I came up with. I think everybody here knows about the Gartner hype cycle. This is one from, I don't know which year, July 2017, so it's a very recent one. Everybody knows this? Yeah? If you don't know that? Okay. So the Gartner hype cycle plots all of the emerging technologies on the different stage of where the technology is. And we'll say every technology will go through the same cycle. Namely, you have the innovation trigger, so that when it starts to pop up, peak of inflated expectations, meaning we all have a series of ideas once we heard about the technology of all the things we can do with it. Then eventually we hear that most of the things you cannot do with it yet because it's just not possible yet, or it's not the idea. And then it takes a while before it actually goes to a plateau where it becomes like a really productive tool that we can build a business on, and so on and so forth. And we all get really excited about these new things. And usually when they're really here, when we can really start making money with them, obviously, especially in our industry, because somebody has done something with that before, we're not looking at it anymore because we're not the first, and blah, blah, blah. And there's a very funny thing, there's a slide from that Facebook has, which I like a lot, Yes, and I'm really bad in making PowerPoint slides. So I took the white out, and then it sort of did this. So what essentially is saying, whenever technology comes along, storytelling is at its lowest. It's sort of when the technicians take over from the magicians. We see that in campaigns. Why? Because it's always the technology guy who discovers the technology first, but they don't necessarily have great ideas with it. It takes a while before the storytellers take over. But it's the same thing in business. The first ideas we see with AI or with VR or whatever it is are not great ideas. Whether that's a campaign idea or a business idea, it's not a great idea. It's too much the tech on its own. We just want to do something with that. And I think it's really important. I think we really need to make sure that we understand the possibility of artificial intelligence, that we understand the possibilities of technology for distributed workforce and all that kind of stuff, because those are really important ingredients of what we want to do. But they on their own cannot be a driver for an idea. That would be, we'd focus too much on the technology. And to talk about that a little bit, and I know this is consumer-facing technology, but I think it explains it a lot. When Instagram came along, there was a really beautiful or a really big number of analysis about how the social media that was focused on sharing photos was the thing that was important right now. And I think they kind of missed the point. The true analysis of why Instagram was so big is because it made everybody who uploaded a photo look like a great photographer. That was the feeling I would get from uploading a photo on Instagram. It would make any photo through one of these really 10 beautifully designed filters, it made me feel like a beautiful photographer. There were millions of photo sharing apps already out there, so that wasn't the thing. And it's really important that also in the consumer space, but also in the B2B space, we understand why something came along. Every analysis that we see is around the technology. We see the same thing. When the iPod came along, we understand, yes, that's because of the beautiful design and the one button. That was not why it became successful, right? We all know it. It was the embedded solution with iPod and iTunes. I don't know, you're probably all younger than I am, but the difficulty of uploading or getting an MP3 song on a hardware device before, that was, a very different thing. But that was what made it beautiful. The same thing as this. You see analysis that is saying, this is the dash button. People are talking about the Internet of Things. It's not the Internet of Things that makes this successful. What makes this successful is that somebody understands that when you're loading your laundry machine, and then you put in whatever it is, like these tablets or powder or whatever the thing is that you put in these days, when you put that in and then the box is empty, that you need to order a new box. And then we have different routines. Either you remember it or you take out a part of the cardboard thing and put it on the kitchen table, put the box on the kitchen table, whatever your rhythm is. And in this case, you just push that button, the thing gets ordered, and depending on whether you're Prime or not, it gets delivered to you in the next day. It's not the Internet of Things. It is a human understanding of what the person is doing in that scenario, and then how that technology can enable a solution for that. And now these are consumer scenarios, but this is what we need to try and figure out for ourselves, for our industry, right? We are looking at, that's why who's the end client, who's our end consumer, how are we helping our end client or consumer the best, is partially by understanding who their end consumer is. And then what is it that we do to help that person the best? Therefore, by saying advertising agency is in a way already boxing what that solution is, which is really interesting. And so before we start thinking the technology that can help us with, this is what we need to figure out first. Different types of innovation, interesting. These are the ones that I think there are in the big groups. And we talked, I heard different groups talk about a little bit of a difference. I think they're all as valuable. I think something to be said for incremental innovation, where you just optimize an existing product or service or an existing offering. One of the challenges of what we do is we all want to be in that disruptive innovation thing, which is a good value. It's sort of creative destruction. We are creating something, but that usually destructs something else. Think about how Uber destructs the taxi industry. But this is only one way. Most of what we can do is in here and is in here. New market innovation introduces new ideas and emerging technology into an existing category in an existing space. So we think about, there's a lot of incremental innovation we can do. I don't think we look at that. Look at, if we think about what it is that your agency or your service, what you want to be, how you can make small tweaks, innovation tweaks, that'll improve your business. We don't do that. We focus on how can we be like something totally disruptive, something else. And I think they're all as valuable, and likely most of our efforts could go in here. There is something to be said about this disruptive innovation, and I'll make a little bit of a drawing on how we see this at Happiness, but and then you can use that or not. But this likely is not something you can do on your own. If you want to disrupt your own business, you got to give money to somebody else and let them do stuff with it, because you're always within the limitation of your own clients, your own business, your own structures, and you'll likely not disrupt hard enough. Then it's really important when we think about innovating that you think about what the vision and the strategy of your business is. And I think part of why we don't get a handle on how we got to use technology or what we got to do is because people talk about, do we need to hire a head of digital or a head of innovation, or do we need to do something with startups, or do we send people to Silicon Valley, or do we do co-creation, or is it VR where we got to be in, or whatever, is because we're not really sure what it adds up to. And I think it's really important. And the best proof of how that vision and that strategy, who you are to whom, is not technology related. I'll show you in an example, and I forgot the name. The book is called Thinking in New Boxes, but I forgot what the guy's name is. Sorry?
Alan Ivy.
No? Thinking in New Boxes? No, it's
Ivy or something like
it's like a yes.
Yes, exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's like a Belgian guy, speaks French, but I forgot his name.
He's head of scenarios and creativity.
Something like that, yeah. It's a fascinating speaker.
Yeah.
And he talks in his book, which is a really, really boring book. But it's if you speak French, I can send you the video. He's a really fascinating speaker. He talks about BIC, so the pen company, and how they innovated, and said, think about initially how BIC was innovating, then think about obviously different kind of colors of pens, different kind of formats. You have the pens with the four thingies on, so you have all of the four colors in there. Probably they could go as far as a connected pen and a smart pen and whatever, that kind of stuff. And it's only by when they changed what they were, as in that they changed it to, we're not a pen company, we're a disposable company, that all of a sudden lighters and the razors, etc., made sense. They're all plastic-made disposables, and then it seems to fit within that big company. So it's a big, just reframing of what it was that they were, what they were to whom, that all of a sudden they could place other innovative ideas in the company, how they make sense. Otherwise, if you're a pen company and then a guy comes to you and said, why don't we make a lighter? It's like, what does this have to do with anything that we are? And I think that's really important. And I can think about what you are to whom. So I didn't talk about who I was. Maybe I should have done that in the beginning. But so my name is Kris, and I'm a co-founder of an agency called Happiness. And we have an office. We always say Happiness, with offices in Brussels, Saigon, and anywhere. And that's literally, we have an office in Brussels and one in Saigon. That is the literal, but we have a few people that are on our payroll that just work from where they live. So there's a guy who is a creative who lives in New York. We really like working with him. He's a good creative. So the idea that therefore he needs to work in our office, that is an old idea. Think about the super freelancers, although it's really hard to make it work, but that's something that we do, therefore the anywhere notion to it. Happiness is not named Happiness just because that's like a nice word to use, but because it's essential to what we believe, what our role in the business is. We believe that if we can influence how a brand connects with a consumer or vice versa, anywhere that's possible, that will deliver a little bit of contentment to ultimate joy. That's what we want to do. That delivers more happiness, and happy consumers brings you more business. That's essentially what we want to do. That's a really short pitch. But that means that we sort of already redefine for ourselves that we are not an advertising agency. We call ourselves a creative connectivity agency. What we try and do is define what the connections between brands and consumers are, and see if we can make that a little bit better. But that means that connection could also be the flow on a specific form. That could be how you walk into the showroom. And although still 90% of what we do is advertising, it sort of puts us in a little bit of, we try at least to put us a little bit of a spectrum, but we define what it is that we want to do for brands, so we define what the role is for brand. It's important because it means when we start looking at innovation, whether that's some of that incremental small changes or where we try and build new services, that we have a little bit more room for that because we're not just making ads. Or you could say just making ads. I'm not meaning anything disdain for that because I love that business, but it gives a little bit of a better idea of where we want to innovate to. And that's what I think is important for everybody to define. What is your role to whom? Because it'll help you guide what kind of innovation you need to do. I think if you haven't defined that, then you'll just start looking at things that are happening in the industry, and then you got to do something with it because everybody else is doing something with it, and that gives you no guidance. For me, it helps for our agency to say, there's nothing in there for us, there's something in there for us, right? One of the things, so we talked about almost automatically, organically, how you really need to make sure that you know what you are to whom, because that is what needs to guide you thinking about all of the innovation possibilities or innovation can you do, that they still make sense. And I think what most people and most brands and most of our clients, but most ourselves underestimate, is that you need to have the right people and the right culture for it as well. Most of the innovation ideas fail. We'll talk a little bit about the premise tomorrow, which is the reason why you innovate and why that is wrong, and that is a reason of failure. A lot of why they fail is because they're disconnected or you don't have the right people, the right culture for it. Even though we think we have, and this is client research, but I'm likely think if you ask the agencies, I think the numbers would be even bigger in difference. Look at the innovation maturity from a leadership point of view or from the employee's point of view. You see there is a big difference in how much either leadership or the people feel they're ready for it. And I think with agencies, we typically tend to think we're at least like 30% better than we are. So likely both the leadership think this is higher as their employees, but the gap will still be there. Another interesting one is, if you think about innovation again, have organizations dedicated physical space for innovation and then carrying out innovation beyond those centers is really another good notion that and see that most of the time, most of the innovation labs that brands have started in the last few years are now either being diminished, closed, or budget has been, for the simple reason that that single hub where they sort of start doing new things with startup but doesn't translate to their business. So they've done something in innovation, but in the corner with the closed off doors, that seemed to work out fine, but it didn't change any of their, 100, 10,000, whatever employee or regular business. And part of what you see there is because they haven't changed anything in that innovation culture in their own structure. Culture, which you don't create, is a byproduct of consistent behavior. Favorite cartoonist, let's sing Kumbaya until the ideas come, and we'll go back to our desk and come up with 100 reasons why they'll never ever work in a million years. I guess most of you we work for a big German, this is one of our global clients, a big German, I can't say which company it is, a big German how can I? No, it's not a. It's a FMCG. Yeah, I'll keep it at that. Where you typically, this is literally what you're feeling right now. So there is a small innovation hub. They put 10 different people from all around the company around the table that came up with some ideas that are fairly straightforward. And that was 6 months ago. And so they're now been discussing all of the possible hoops that are making these ideas impossible, and nothing's really happening. And we're watching it from the sideline. It's a really important question to ask, if you have the right culture for innovation. And I have a theory about this. One of the things is that you got to rethink how you collaborate with your colleagues. And so my theory is this, that remember the hype cycle, the Gartner hype cycle, how we discover technology. And I think there is no one hype cycle, as in for the company, right? That doesn't exist, or for the industry, or for whatever it is. There is one for each and every one of us. And then so likely the technologist is the first person, if we have any type of technologist, the head of digital, whatever it is, in our company is likely the first one to do that for every new technology. And then let's just say, for the sake of conversation, the creative is next, and then the planner, and then the producer. And the only thing I'm sure of is the technologist is first and the lawmaker is last. So these are that debatable. But that's interesting, I think, if you think about, because it kind of means that by the time, say, the planner or whatever it is, the second or the third person gets excited about technology and then talks about the technology about it, then he's already in this through of disillusion, and so doesn't really want to think about it anymore. Because you'll come up with, say, we could do this and this and this, and then the other guy already figured out that none of these things are possible, and it's not even an exciting conversation. This is what happens, right? That's important. And I think one of the reasons why we get so excited about this creative technologist profile is that actually we got the technologist and the creative being one person to discover these things at the same time, right? So that doesn't mean that the creative technologist that's an interesting profile, but it could also mean that what if we could make sure that we got everybody, all of the profiles in the company, discovering new things at the same time, then at least they would all get excited about at the same time and go through a disillusion at the same time. So think about the things we could discover and come up with if we would do it that way. I think that's my theory. This is why the creative technologist is such a popular profile, because that's these two profiles into one. So obviously discovering these things at the same time and doing something with it. So but we could organize us for it. The second thing which I think is important if you think about culture is these three levels of mindset, skill set, and tool set that are linked to whatever it is that we're doing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. So in general, I think an innovative mindset is collaborative, and collaborative in a new way. So not collaborative in terms of, yes, we have meetings with other peoples and that kind of stuff, but collaborative in where you're much more open in how you share with other people. Typically in an agency business, what happens is the creative, usually that are non-technology focused or have their own way of working, will then have a technology idea and then go to the technology person and say, here is something I want you to figure out for me. Meaning the guy or the girl who doesn't know anything about a certain thing will tell the guy who knows all about it what they need to figure out where, which seems odd, right? So in a much more open, and that's why open is here as well, collaborative spirit, you would almost say, and I put these ideas on the wall, and then anybody that looks at this can comment and give feedback on that. It's a very difficult. That's why I'm very open to talk about anything, even much more insightful things about what we do as an organization, because I don't want you specifically to say, maybe you have something to say, but likely you throw things back at me that I think are interesting and that are useful for me, and you'll take something back for that. I think it's interesting, especially in the industry they're in. Some people were talking about we are in the creative industry, and I think it's right, but we got to define what it is that we are to whom. Probably you want to be a little bit more specific, as an artist is also in the creative industry, and that's not necessarily where we want to be. But we are in a creative industry, and it's important to understand what the role of that creativity is in what we want to sell clients. But the good thing is, innovation is essentially about creativity because it's new ideas, and it's ideas, so that's essential. And then in terms of skill set, and I was a little bit talking about this before, but you want to understand that consumer, so empathy is a really important thing. Whether you solve some of that through the empathy map or specific modules that there are to help you with that empathy, but understanding what the consumer are, and then instead of problem solving, problem finding, defining what it is the problem that you try and solve is an interesting one, and then a prototype. There's an interesting research from Google that showed, and that's again building up on that, the power of collaboration. But they looked at the most efficient teams, and they noticed that the most efficient teams were people that met outside of work. So not necessarily the teams how they define in a day-to-day basis, but some of the people that were colleagues but didn't work together, but how they met another were more efficient. So again, sort of type of proof, how do I make sure that one, can I get everybody to discover new things at the same time, get excited about new things? What would that do with it? And how can I make sure that within that collaborative spirit, people can collaborate better, know what it is? Because you cannot invite everybody to the creative brief, or you cannot, and everybody just start ideating. Even though the motion designer might have good ideas, you cannot just say, okay, one day less of motion design, you go create. That's not efficient time. But still, how do you get that opinion in there? So it's a difficult exercise to make. How do you get the client's idea in there at some point, right? Typically something that a creative team doesn't want to look at because the client idea is never interesting. Well, actually, sometimes they have really good ideas. So how do you get that in there? And they know their business best. So knowing that maybe the art director and a client would make a really good team. What does that mean as a concept in working together? As I said, share your ideas, because if you share it more openly, that gives other people different kind of feedback, which you would never specifically request it. Feedback on questions you haven't asked. So I think that's really interesting. It's something that is very uncomfortable for, call it the traditional creatives, because they own and they're very defensive about their ideas. I think in a more open and innovative collaborative spirit, we want these ideas to be more open. Does that mean that they can't own them anymore? Of course they can, but it's a different dynamic. Go away from, like I said before, we call it co-creative management. Go away from the traditional way and how you put 2 weeks of work in the client side, 2 weeks of work agency side, 2 weeks, et cetera, and the rework. The biggest change that was done in manufacturing once was done by Toyota, and again, I'll probably mess up this whole story and tell it wrong, but they changed manufacturing where in the beginning, or before they changed it, anything in manufacturing, whether it was a car or whatever it was that you made in like a manufacturing line, only the last person, the boss, could decide at the end of when it was the finished product, whether that product was of the quality that it could be delivered to the client or whether it was not good enough in the quality. Meaning the product was totally made, right? So Toyota changed it in terms that anybody on the manufacturing line could stop the line if they thought something was going wrong. Something with the biggest twist, because initially they said, no, only the boss is smart enough to make this kind of decision. At the same time, obviously making so that the product was made before that decision was taken. Saying, no. Everybody has that responsibility if something is not going in the right direction to change that. How do we are doing that, right? Why don't we change some of our insights earlier with a client, maybe with a phone call, or just say, hey, are you there tomorrow morning? Can I stop by and have a few thoughts here? It's challenging, right? Because we're used to a model where we go to a client with finished stuff. not with sort of, here's a few bigger thoughts that we want to discuss. It feels almost like we don't know what we're doing. We actually believe that it adds more value to that space. I'm not sure who's read the book Yes and? Nobody? Okay. So, very important, especially if you're trying to innovate in your own business as well as with your clients, that you got to keep and make sure, and I find this particularly challenging, so I'll be very honest with that, but I think it's really, really true. But to build up on another one's idea, at least see where it can go, right? Especially if it's newer ideas or newer domains, we see limitations, right? We see limitations. We see all of the things why something cannot be done. Yes, and says you first try and see how you can move forward with it. It comes out of improv comedy, and typically from improv comedy, if you have two people on a stage and the first person opens the scene with a sentence, the second person cannot say, "No, that's not a good start, let's start somewhere else." He's obliged to build on that sentence and then see where it goes. And once you feel this is how far we can take it, then you stop. Yes, and is that perspective. So especially if you're the newer things, think about it for your own company or for ideas for a client, but try and see where can you go with that. Not immediately say, that's not going to work, I've been in that business before, know the client for a long time, he's never going to buy it.
Yeah, it's the yes and versus no but.
Yeah.
But that means also that you're creating culture within the team to know how to give this sort of feedback.
Yeah.
It's very hard.
It's difficult because change is hard, right? There's a lot of things from incremental innovation to bigger innovation that we're launching in the agency, and some of it that doesn't work or not the way I want it to work, because we are an animal that is, linked to our behaviors that we know. I always just say one thing: often creatives will come, especially when they have newer ideas and they try to sell it into a client, and then the client didn't want to buy the new idea because it was so different from what before, and the creative will be frustrated. Because obviously they want to do the thing that has never been done before, and then the client is a little bit more into, I got to deliver on that brief, on that result, this is where my bonus is, and so they are hesitant on that. And then I want to sell in new ideas, that's all fine, but the best way for me to challenge the creatives is I'll always ask them, when was the last time you changed something in your routine, in the way you work? And then usually they got to think back way. So just to put in a perspective, you're asking somebody to change the way they're doing campaigns or think about promoting this kind of thing, and you haven't done anything yourself in that creative process. Think about the openly sharing thing on the ideas on the wall. Very difficult topic at Happiness, right? Even if I'm a fond believer of it, very difficult topic. We have creatives that are openly sort of interchange roles. I mean, that are not a fixed team as we used to know it, but we also have teams that are sort of those two, and that's it. And they're really successful that way, so it's hard to argue that doesn't work. But we can't even see if it would work better if we change, because they're very protective about that. So I'll quickly skip through this. I don't have all the explanation. There is something called The 10 Phases of Innovation. It's one of the books that was on the list. What is interesting, and you don't have to follow it letter by letter, but it sort of talks about how you have different kind of innovators, and how it's interesting that when you form a team, whether that is an internal team to rethink about what you want to do in the agency or on innovative client projects, that you make sure that you don't have innovators of the same type, right? Because you're not going towards those goals. So it's definitely interesting that you take a look at those 10 types. It's an older book. I think it was from IDEO, and you likely see updates online. Again, don't follow it through the letter, but the idea that there's different types of innovators and making sure that it's not because you have two people that are all about new and change, they might be too much of the same for it to make change happen. What do they have in common? Constantly associate disparate domains. I think somebody said it before, which I think is really interesting, but where you take things from domains that, on the surface have nothing to do with each other, but by mixing them you get into these newer territories. Question the status quo. There's another thing, and I shouldn't reference him anymore because he's got all cooked up in this Me Too thing now. But I was a really big fan of Louis C.K., which is I thought was a really amazing comedian, and now he's a fucktard, but that's too bad. But he made a comedy routine, which I call Of Course, But Maybe. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask. So to go, of course, but maybe, just to get, I'm a very bad comedian, but just to get the comedy, he said that he has two sides of his brain. Of course, like the normal thing, and then there was this, what he called, but maybe. And every time he saw something, he read something, he said, oh, of course, and then always but maybe, the bad thing happens. And for instance, he said, war is a really bad thing. It's people die because you're shooting, and that's bad, really bad. And he says, but maybe when you get killed from the person you're shooting at, that's a tiny bit your own fault. So I thought I was inspiring, again, to use in my own business, because often when you see strategy, I think it's an interesting exercise to do. What you see in the paper, you'd say, of course, I can totally make sense. But maybe, the opposite is true as well. Or maybe there's something else. I mean, that you challenge a little bit in, aren't we taking this insight, or aren't we taking this is what needs to be done to solve the problem, etc., a little bit too much for granted because this is what we've been doing, or this is what's been asked, or etc. So, question the status quo. Observe familiar settings to spot new problems. Follow the intuition to experiment. Also, make sure that you, especially if you're in leadership, whatever the team is, but make sure that you reward experimentation. If you don't reward experimentation, experimentation doesn't happen. This is very simple. And then network to get ideas, not resources. Meaning, again, that you make sure that you talk to other people in a different kind of collaboration, as I said before, and work with people because they'll build up on your ideas. Don't only add people to the team because you need more work done and therefore need more people. Very important and very big difference. And then think about, I think you should do that exercise, and I can send the list of, I have a little short write-up of what the 10 profiles are. Think about what type of innovator you think you are. I think it's an interesting exercise to do, so I'll send the list. Also in the inspiration thing, or in the innovation thing, you got to get your inspiration from anywhere. Typical thing for ad agencies, and maybe it's typical for any business, but I've been in advertising too long, is that we get our inspiration from advertising. We get all wild at the can lines and go see what other people have done in the same industry that they win prizes for, but we don't look anywhere else. Which is nonsense. My biggest source of inspiration, and you might have noticed that a little bit with Louis C.K. and the Yes and, but is comedy. Most of my innovative insights or strategy insight are coming straight out of comedy. And if you want to get a little bit of a feel on how comedy, for instance, could bring you really great ideas, then you should watch this. This is an HBO special called Talking Funny, where you see the 4 best comedians on the planet talking to each other about how they develop a comedy routine, which is really, really powerful.
Video or no, just pictures?
It's just, this is not a video. It's you can find it online. It's Talking Funny, HBO. So think about where you get your inspiration from. We really again, are talking to clients how they should open up and look outside of their own business, look at yourself. That's also, part of empathy. Look at yourself and see, but what is it that I'm bringing to the table that is different than that routine that I've been bringing to the table to all of these other clients that is very specific to my routine. This doesn't mean that I'll bring comedy to all of my clients' things, not at all, but you try and figure out what the benefit. One of the biggest advantages, I think, in advertising that we have is that by working for so many clients and so many industries, we already automatically bring fresher things to the table for what it relates to our clients, because we do the car brand also when we're the hamburger brand or whatever it is, but we need to do that for ourselves as well. Skin in the game. Really, really important part. Again, like I said, what I said to my creatives as well, or to anybody in the agency, we talk a lot about how we expect others to change or to innovate or do things differently, but what have we done differently or innovated lately in our own routine? How challenging are you yourself to discovering newer things? I think that's really, really important and something that we underestimate. If you want to get that culture of innovation right, this is something that you want to challenge your people for. I'm challenging everybody in the team almost to get their own experiments that not necessarily relate to a client. It's easy to experiment. Everybody wants to experiment on a client, especially if they can do it outside of their work hours. Work hours are full. Same for me. If I want to experiment, this is on my own time and with my own tools. But I've learned a lot through them. I have a few in there. I'm not going to give all of the examples, just a few one. It's important. Anybody knows the difference between the chicken and the pig? You know what I'm going to say?
Yeah, commitment.
Yes. The difference between a chicken and a pig in the egg and bacon breakfast. The chicken is involved, the pig is committed. So we want to be the pig in innovation. Give one example. I actually worked most of my time client side. I used to work at Microsoft in a day that the company was perceived a little bit less exciting than it is today. It was a time when, what did we launch? Vista. What else? We changed MSN into Windows Live. I didn't make those decisions, to be clear, but that was sort of the time frame. But we were trying to do the right thing. And then there is a cartoonist, which is called Hugh Mccloud. It goes under the name of Gaping Void, who was really, I'm talking 2005, 2006 or so, when blogging was like a big thing. And he had a popular blog called Gaping Void, and he made cartoons on the back of business cards. And one day he made a cartoon, which was this one, says Microsoft changed the world or go home. And a lot of the blogger community would go like, yeah, fuck yeah, and this is really, and I go, fuck you, Microsoft, and this is so... And then what happened was that I think Steve Clayton, myself, and maybe some other guy that worked at Microsoft started using this cartoon on our own blog and also in our own presentation. And then people didn't understand because it was like against Microsoft. Why would we use it? And it was really interesting because by using this, people would come to me and say, why are you using it? And I says, yeah, because I think it's right. If you make $1 million profit a month, then I think it can be people's expectation that you got to do some world-changing stuff. And then people would say, yes, but you aren't. And I said, sure we are. And I said, no, you're not. Sure we are. And I said, tell me. And then they say, yeah, we do this, and we do this, and we do this, and we do this. And all of a sudden, I was talking about Microsoft in an open invitation to talk about it. I can tell you, if you would go to an event before and say, hey, can I tell you a little bit about what we're doing at Microsoft? People go like, dude, fuck off, this is not what you can talk about. So I learned something, what we then later call the social object, is sometimes it is, the creation of a social object is interesting, because not so much what is the object itself is saying, but what it allows you, or how it invites you to a conversation. And this actually, what this cartoon, while at Microsoft learned me, translated into some of the work that we did at Duval Guillaume, although this was a very small experiment in a way. but when we did a film for Carlsberg called Bikers, and if you've seen the film, it's again a YouTube thing where people, a couple buys a ticket in the cinema, and if they enter the cinema hall or whatever you call it, they notice that there's the cinema hall is full of like Hell's Angels. There's like only 2 seats left, like in the middle of the, and so the question is if they'll go sit down or not. I think 20 million people or so saw it, but what we noticed is, what we had learned, that this would get people to talk about their own courage. So this is what they would share it for, not as in haha fun, but they would share it saying, I would so not have done this, or I would definitely do this, that kind of stuff. But we noticed that if we can make something that would trigger that conversation, which came out of this little personal experiment. I'll give you one other example. I'm doing a little email newsletter. It's called Warped. I spend a lot of time doing that newsletter, which puts pretty much every interesting idea that I see or find that relates to data or technology or creative in a newsletter for anybody to subscribe to. Again, with this notion of the more that I share about what I find, the more that I'll get back. And it's an interesting experiment. A couple of times, first of all, trying to figure out how MailChimp works. That's interesting on its own. But also to see how that dynamic works. And I think that dynamic does work because it opened new doors for me, and it got people to send me more things that we then used in campaigns. But there's something that I would never have figured out before doing so. So I think it's really important that you find your own little experiments, your own things where you challenge your own boundaries. I don't know where it...
How often do you send it?
Every week. Yeah. So every week, and then I probably miss 15 weeks a year or so. It goes up, the number of weeks I miss. But that's... But again, it's a try. I sent the first newsletter to me, just to see if I could do it. It's true. That's another example. I tried to figure out Instagram a little bit more outside of my own account. So I've made, with a friend of mine, we made a Instagram account called Best Cycling Kits that has beautiful cycling kits, because most cycling kits, like the team jerseys you see in the Tour de France, are butt ugly. But there's like really beautiful ones from small design studios. So we've put them on there. The account exists for about a year or so, year and a half. So it has now just over 40,000 followers, which is interesting because we get brands to ask us for paid posts. We learned about something called Instagram pods. I don't know if anybody knows the Instagram pod. So Instagram pod is similar accounts that group together. This is like... frenemies, basically, whatever you would call it, your similar accounts grouped together. And they used to do it on Instagram, now do it on WhatsApp, so a little bit further away from Instagram, where they'll share new posts with each other, and they'll always like each other's post right away. The reason for that is because for professional accounts, it's really important to own hashtags. And the way to own a hashtag is the number of likes you get on a photo in the first hour. So the Instagram pods sort of serve to make sure that you get a lot of guaranteed posts in that first hour, so you are always in the top 9 of the hashtag. These things that obviously come to use for brands, I only know because I've been experimenting in the space. Again, I think you really should experiment. It's really hard if you tell a client and say you should experiment more and you should prototype and you should blah blah blah, and you've never done anything like that in your own space, in your own time. Then you got to understand how much you sort of forget how much it is you're demanding of the other party, but you're not investing that. Yes, you wish the other invested their money in all these kind of things, but you're not doing that with your own time. Your own time is more valuable to you to do that, so that you'll use to go mountain biking or ride cars or whatever. That's what I do. What did you learn today? I'll go over it quite quickly, but this is a question that I'll ask everywhere I go and present when I work into the FCB network. And this is not about what did you take away from the presentation I gave or any time, but this is a question I think everybody should ask themselves every day at the end of the day. So a quick thing on process and methodology, and again, I don't want to discuss on that. There's two things that we want to talk about. Well, first of all, which is an interesting one, and again, a little bit about culture, but why the process is needed. Even CEOs who see the need for change don't know how to deal with it. And that gap is getting bigger. So the gap, every year that research happens, we see that the gap between the realization of I gotta change and me thinking I can cope with that change is getting bigger. So it's getting worse. And likely not only because we don't have that vision line up to where the innovation needs to go to, but that's likely not the biggest issue. We don't have the right culture, but also we don't have the methodologies for it. Salim Ismail says, when you try to innovate within a big company, its immune system will attack you. So companies are set up almost to do the opposite. Rather than innovate, they're like making sure that none of the innovation happens. There's a couple of things I want to go through the details of this, but when you think about innovation, you can think about innovation-style projects. This is what we usually show to companies, and again, not as in exactly to look at the different examples, but you got to think about how, just to try and frame a little bit where you want to do your innovation first, because most of the companies, first of all, are really excited about these kind of things like Lego is doing and all that kind of stuff, but it basically means that you're like a little bit more versed into innovation. It's not your first thing, you have some experience. And also a big challenge for companies is in how open they want to be about that innovation. How open, we want to do the Lego type thing, but we also don't want anybody to know what anything that's on there. That's sort of like that, just that doesn't really work. We talked about design thinking. I think it's an interesting process, and I don't have anything on design thinking in here, but just the idea that, and that's where the human-centric or the human-centered design, where the human-centric comes in advance, where you're basically saying, just like a designer, that's where the theory comes from, a designer is focused on the consumer when they are designing and, from frame to frame. There's a really interesting thinking in that we should explore for all of the things that we do, because it gets us more in a human-centric. What I think is interesting is something that Notosh did. A friend of mine called Hugh Mccloud has a consultancy firm called Notosh. They have their own version of whatever the design thinking is, the stages, immersion, synthesis, ideation, prototyping, and then feed forward instead of feedback. Again, this is the yes and attitude onto feedback and the play of words. But what is interesting, again, when you got to with this client or for yourself, look into that you have, whenever you're in each state, that you look at whether you have the right mindset, skill set, and tool set for that state. It's really important, because when people are, like we are here today, exploring what the future of our business could be, that at the same time we make sure that if somebody is making a conclusion into what should be right or wrong, then that person is not in the same mindset as you are. You're in a mindset of opening up, so anything that looks like closing down is a mindset for another step. So I think it's interesting if you talk about these things, because you can make sure that when you are in that innovation process, that you're sure that everybody in your group here or with your client in a project or wherever it is in the same stage. And by defining it that way, you could sort of help define what it is that the stage is that people need to be on. It's not because we all know we're in this brainstorming thing that we're mentally in the same space, right? So this is why I think this is an interesting, and to keep part of the, to make it tangible, I guess, in how you want to think about innovation and where you should focus your time on. If you look at the model that we have, we'll make sure, and this is a model that I think Coke published on their Content 2020 film like 3-4 years ago. This was related to content, but I like the idea of the model, which is called their 70-20-10. Coke put this up as communication. They basically said 70% is what we call their bread and butter, meaning that 70% of what they do will be, in their case, TV and outdoor, because that always works for them. They know that gets the success. 20% would be innovation network, so social, because they've done social before. Facebook, they know they can have results with that. They have a large user base, etc. And 10% was there with the objective to learn. I think it's really interesting if you think about your business and you want to innovate, think about both the incremental as the new market, as the disruptive part, that you sort of use this as a guidance, especially if you're innovating out of an existing business. A lot of the innovation that is related to that 70% of where your core of your business is. We are a creative connectivity agency. We're innovating in that space. That helps us to widen it. But 70% likely what we do is advertising, so that needs to be better on its own. We just need to make sure it fits in that creative connectivity agency setup. And then all the way down to a couple of things that we do, which is really hard to do usually in an agency, because as an agency, you typically sell a thing first to a client, and when they buy it, then you make sure you're set up for it that way, because this is how we, otherwise we'd never make money. But you got to find your space where you do things where the only objective is to learn. It's really difficult, right? It means there is no money involved necessarily, or no revenue involved, but you still are putting the time in or the effort in, or see how that works.